Sometimes the loneliest man can stumble into the greatest mystery. In the frozen mountains of 1883 Montana, broke cowboy Caleb Stratton is barely surviving winter when he finds something impossible, a wounded donkey leading him somewhere with purpose. Following the animal through blinding snow, Caleb discovers a massive steel door buried in the mountainside, glowing with orange lights and covered in symbols he's never seen. Inside waits a discovery that will shake everything he knows, a military base filled with technology from a war that won't happen for 60 years. The real shock comes when Caleb finds his own name in a file marked "Required Arrival 1883. Why would a future base be waiting for a nobody cowboy? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story intrigues you, subscribe because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Stratton's fingers had gone numb 2 hours ago, maybe 3. Time lost meaning when you were this cold, this hungry, this far from anything resembling hope. He trudged through the snowdrift, each step requiring a conscious effort of will, his boots barely holding together after 6 months of hard travel. The Montana mountains stretched endlessly around him, white and merciless under a grey sky that promised more snow before nightfall. He was 42 years old, though he felt 60. The wind had carved lines into his face that made him look like weathered leather, and his beard, once dark brown, now showed threads of grey that hadn't been there a year ago. His coat, a heavy wool thing he'd bought in better times, was frayed at the cuffs and had a tear along the left shoulder that let the cold seep through like water through a broken dam. In his pocket, wrapped in an oilcloth, sat the only thing of value he still owned, his father's brass compass. Caleb pulled it out now, more from habit than need, and watched the needle spin lazily before settling north. The brass had dulled over the years, no longer catching the light the way it had when his father pressed it into his palm 20 years ago. "A man always needs to know which direction he's heading, son," his father had said. William Stratton, owner of a modest but prosperous ranch in the valley near Bozeman, a man who'd built something real from nothing. "This compass belonged to my father and his father before him. It's kept 3 generations of Stratton men pointed true." Caleb closed his fist around the compass, feeling the cold metal against his palm. Pointed true. He almost laughed at the bitter irony. The compass might know north from south, but it couldn't tell a man when he'd taken a wrong turn in life. Couldn't warn him about bad business partners or fool investments or the 100 small decisions that added up to ruin. He'd had it all once. Not much by some standards, but enough. A small ranch of his own, carved from land his father had helped him purchase. 60 head of cattle, good grazing land, a sturdy house with a stone fireplace that kept the winter at bay. And Sarah, dark-haired Sarah with her quick laugh, and her way of making even beans and cornbread taste like a feast. They'd been married 3 years, planning for children, talking about the future like it was something solid they could build together. Then came Marcus Wheaton, with his smooth talk and his guaranteed returns. "A cattle venture in Wyoming," he'd said. "Triple your investment in 2 years," he'd promised. All Caleb had to do was put up his land as collateral, just a formality, just to show good faith to the other investors. 6 months later, Wheaton disappeared with every cent. The venture had been smoke and mirrors. The other investors just marks like Caleb. The bank foreclosed. The cattle were sold at auction, and Sarah, who'd begged him not to trust Wheaton, who'd seen through the man's charm to the predator underneath, packed her things and went to live with her sister in Denver. "I can't watch you destroy yourself." "Caleb," she'd said, tears streaming down her face, "I can't stay and watch you drown." That had been 8 months ago. Since then, he'd drifted from town to town, taking work where he could find it. Ranch hand, stable mucker, freight hauler. Each job lasting a few weeks before he moved on, unable to settle, unable to face the pity in people's eyes when they realized he was one of Wheaton's victims. Everyone in Montana had heard about the swindle by now. He'd been heading toward a mining camp someone mentioned in the last town, hoping for winter work. But he'd misjudged the distance, or maybe the map had been wrong, or maybe he'd just been too tired to read it properly. Either way, he'd been caught in the high mountains when the first real storm of the season hit 3 days ago. He'd found shelter in a cave that first night, managed to shoot a rabbit the second day, but his supplies were gone now. No food, no ammunition left for his rifle. Just the clothes on his back, his father's compass, and a stubbornness that wouldn't let him lie down and die, even though part of him whispered that it might be easier. The wind shifted, bringing a fresh assault of snow that stung his face. Caleb pulled his collar up higher and kept walking, though he wasn't sure why anymore. The mining camp was probably still 2 days away if the weather cleared. But the weather wasn't going to clear. He could feel it in the air, that heavy pressure that meant a real blizzard was coming. The kind that could bury a man and not spit him out until spring thaw. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and he stumbled, going down on one knee. The impact jarred his whole body, and for a long moment he stayed there, kneeling in the snow, wondering if this was it. If this was the place he'd finally stop. Some future traveler would find his bones in a few months, maybe find the compass and wonder about the man who'd carried it. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland. A bray, thin and pained, carried on the wind. Caleb lifted his head, squinting against the snow. There, maybe 30 yards ahead, something moved. A shape darker than the surrounding white, struggling through a drift. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle protesting, and moved toward the sound. As he got closer, the shape resolved into something impossible. A donkey. A grey donkey, small and scraggly, with ice crusted in its fur and what looked like blood on its left flank. What in God's name? Caleb muttered, approaching slowly. The donkey turned to look at him, and Caleb stopped dead. There was something in that look. Something too knowing, too purposeful for a dumb animal lost in a storm. The donkey was in bad shape. The wound on its flank looked deep, maybe from a mountain lion or a wolf. Its legs trembled with exhaustion, and frost had formed around its muzzle. By all rights, it should collapse any moment. But instead, it took a few steps forward, looked back at Caleb, then continued on. Caleb stood there, confused. The animal wasn't running from him. It was leading him. He was sure of it. The donkey moved with deliberate intent, following some path only it could see, glancing back every few steps, as if to make sure Caleb was following. "You're crazy," Caleb said to himself, following a half-dead donkey through a blizzard. This is how men die, but he followed anyway. What else did he have? The donkey seemed to know where it was going, which was more than Caleb could say for himself. And there was something about the animal's determination, its refusal to give up despite its wounds, that resonated with something deep in his chest. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes. Though time had that strange elastic quality again, the donkey never faltered, never deviated from its path. It led Caleb up a slope, around a cluster of rocks, and then along what might have been a game trail in summer, but was now just a narrow channel through deeper drifts. The wind had picked up, and visibility had dropped to maybe 15 feet. Caleb was relying on following the donkey's dark shape through the white. His mind had gone to that place beyond cold, beyond exhaustion, where you just kept moving because stopping meant dying. Then the donkey stopped. Caleb nearly walked into it before he realized. The animal stood perfectly still, facing what looked like a sheer rock wall rising out of the snow. Caleb moved up beside it, placing a hand on the donkey's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the cold fur. "What are we doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse and cold. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks, that the cold had finally addled his brain. But no. There it was, impossible and undeniable. A door. Not a cave entrance or a natural formation, but a door. A massive steel door, perfectly rectangular, set into the mountain face as if the rock had grown around it. Caleb took a step closer, his heart suddenly pounding. The door was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The metal was smooth, unmarred by rust, with a dull grey finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strange part was the lights. Orange lights, small and circular, arranged in a pattern along the door's right side. They glowed with a steady, artificial brilliance that had no business existing on a Montana mountainside in 1883, and the symbols. The door was covered in symbols, markings that looked almost like letters but weren't any alphabet Caleb recognized. They were precise, mechanical, stamped or etched into the metal with a uniformity that spoke of machinery, not human hands. Caleb reached out with a trembling hand and touched the door. The metal was cold, but not as cold as it should be. Not ice cold like everything else in these mountains. It was cool to the touch, as if something on the other side was generating heat. He pulled his hand back and looked at the donkey. The animal had sunk down into the snow, its legs finally giving out. It looked at Caleb with those two knowing eyes and let out a soft, almost relieved sound. "You brought me here," Caleb said, understanding flowing through him. "This is what you wanted to show me." The donkey's eyes closed slowly, opened again. Its breathing was labored now, each breath a visible cloud in the frigid air. Caleb looked back at the door, his mind racing. This wasn't natural. This wasn't possible. Doors didn't grow out of mountains. Lights didn't glow without fire or gas. And those symbols, those precise mechanical symbols, looked like nothing from any civilization he knew, but he was freezing to death. And the donkey, which had somehow known this was here, had led him to it for a reason. Caleb examined the door more closely. There had to be a way to open it. No one builds a door without a way through. His eyes traveled over the surface, searching for a handle, a latch, anything. The orange lights drew his attention. There were 7 of them, arranged in a vertical line. As he leaned closer, he noticed that one of them, the one at chest height, was slightly recessed, as if it could be pressed. He looked back at the donkey one more time. The animal had laid its head down in the snow, exhausted but peaceful, as if its job was done. Caleb turned back to the door. He reached out and pressed the recessed light. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then came a sound, unlike anything Caleb had ever heard. A hiss, sharp and mechanical, like steam but different. More controlled. The door shuddered, and Caleb stepped back quickly. There was a series of clicks, heavy and metallic, like massive locks disengaging. Then, with a smooth motion that should have been impossible for something so large, the door began to swing inward. Warm air rushed out, carrying with it a smell Caleb couldn't identify. Not wood smoke, not coal. Something else, something artificial and strange. The interior was dark, but not completely. More of those orange lights, smaller ones, lined what appeared to be a corridor, stretching back into the mountain. Caleb stood at the threshold, caught between terror and desperate need. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that he should run, that whatever lay beyond this door was dangerous beyond his understanding. But the warmth called to him, and the promise of shelter from the storm, and the simple fact that he had nowhere else to go. He took one step inside, then another. The floor beneath his feet was smooth and level, not stone but something else, something that rang hollow when his boot heel struck it. The orange lights provided just enough illumination to see that the corridor was perfectly straight. The walls and ceiling meeting at precise right angles that nature never produced. Behind him, he heard the donkey struggle to its feet. Caleb turned and watched as the animal limped across the threshold, moving past him deeper into the corridor before finally collapsing again. This time, with a finality that suggested it had reached its destination. Caleb looked back at the open door, at the swirling snow beyond, at the last glimpse of the world he knew. Then he looked ahead into the impossible corridor with its strange lights and its promise of answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The door began to swing closed on its own, moving with the same smooth mechanical precision. Caleb didn't try to stop it. He watched as the gap narrowed, as the last bit of natural light disappeared, as the door sealed shut with a final decisive click that echoed down the corridor. He was inside now. There was no going back. Caleb Stratton, broke cowboy with nothing left to lose, stood in an impossible place and waited for his eyes to adjust to the orange light. Whatever lay ahead, it had been waiting for him. The donkey had known. The door had opened. And somewhere deep in this place, buried in the mountain, Caleb suspected, were answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's compass, needing the comfort of its familiar weight. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north, circling endlessly, as if all directions had become meaningless. Caleb closed the compass and put it away. His father had been wrong about one thing. Sometimes a man needed to move forward, even when he didn't know which direction he was heading. He began to walk deeper into the impossible corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence, leaving the frozen world behind and stepping into something his mind couldn't yet comprehend. The corridor stretched ahead, seemingly endless, lit by those strange orange lights set into the walls at regular intervals. Caleb moved forward slowly, his hand trailing along the wall for balance. The surface was cold and perfectly smooth, not like worked stone, but something else entirely. Metal, he realized. The walls were metal. His breath came in short bursts, visible in the air but less so than outside. It was warmer here, definitely warmer, though still far from comfortable. The temperature felt regulated somehow, held at a point just above freezing. Enough to prevent a man from dying of exposure, but not enough to feel truly warm. Behind him, the donkey lay where it had fallen, flanks heaving. Caleb glanced back, guilt tugging at him. The animal had saved his life, no question about that. Without it leading him here, he would be buried in a snowdrift by now, frozen solid, waiting for spring thaw to reveal his corpse. But what could he do for it? He had no medical supplies, no way to treat its wounds. The best he could offer was shelter from the storm, and even that might not be enough. "I'll come back for you," he said to the donkey, though he wasn't sure if that was a promise he could keep. "Let me see what's ahead first." The donkey's ear twitched, the only sign it had heard him. Its eyes were closed now, its breathing steadier. Maybe the warmth was helping. Maybe just getting out of the wind was enough. Caleb hoped so. He turned back to the corridor and continued walking. His footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it hard to judge distance. The corridor sloped gently downward, leading deeper into the mountain. Every 20 feet or so, another orange light punctuated the wall, each one identical to the last. After perhaps 50 yards, the corridor widened into a larger space. Caleb stopped at the threshold, his eyes trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a room, roughly square, with the same metal walls and orange lights. But this room had things in it. Furniture, if you could call it that, though unlike any furniture Caleb had seen. Against one wall stood a row of what looked like metal cabinets, tall and narrow, each with a handle set into its front. Next to them was a long table, also metal, with a surface so smooth it reflected the orange light like still water. And in the center of the room sat several chairs, but chairs of such strange design that Caleb wasn't immediately sure of their purpose. They had metal frames and seats made of some dark material that wasn't leather or wood. He moved into the room cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at him. But nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except his own breathing and the soft shuffle of his boots on the metal floor. The room felt dead, abandoned, yet somehow also preserved, as if whoever had left it had intended to return. Caleb approached one of the cabinets and reached for the handle. It was cold under his fingers, smooth like everything else. He pulled, and the cabinet door swung open with a slight squeak of hinges. Inside, shelves held neat stacks of something wrapped in green material. He pulled one down and examined it. The wrapping was unlike any fabric he'd touched. It crinkled slightly when he squeezed it, stiff and waterproof. Whatever was inside was rectangular and surprisingly heavy for its size. He found a seam in the wrapping and tore it open. Inside was a dark green package with more strange writing stamped on its surface. He could make out some of the letters. They were English, he realized with surprise, but the words didn't make sense. Meal Combat Individual read one line. Below that, in smaller letters, production date 1955. Caleb stared at the date, his mind refusing to process it. 1955, 72 years in the future. That couldn't be right. It had to be a mistake, some kind of joke or misprint. But the package felt real in his hands, solid and purposeful. And the date was printed with the same mechanical precision as everything else in this place. He set the package on the table and returned to the cabinet, pulling out more of the wrapped items. They were all the same, all marked with dates in the 1950s. Some said 1952, others 1956, all of them decades in the future. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. This wasn't possible. He was holding things that wouldn't exist for 3/4 of a century, things that shouldn't exist at all. But here they were, solid and real, stacked neatly in a cabinet inside a mountain in Montana. Caleb forced himself to breathe, to think. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd hit his head during the storm, and this was all a fever dream. Maybe he was lying frozen in a snowdrift right now, and his dying brain was conjuring this elaborate fantasy. But no, the package felt too real in his hands, the metal floor too solid under his feet. This was happening, impossible as it seemed. He examined one of the packages more closely, finally figuring out how to open it properly. Inside was food, or at least he assumed it was food. Smaller packages, each labeled with contents he recognized: crackers, cheese, dried meat, but preserved in ways he'd never seen. Everything was wrapped in that same strange, crinkly material, sealed so tightly that no air or moisture could penetrate. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him he hadn't eaten in 2 days. Whatever this place was, whoever had built it, they'd left food behind. Food that, according to the dates, wouldn't spoil for decades, maybe longer. Caleb's practical nature warred with his fear. Eating strange food from the future seemed like a terrible idea. But starving to death seemed worse. He pulled out what looked like a cracker, examined it, smelled it. It didn't smell bad. In fact, it barely smelled like anything. He took a tiny bite, ready to spit it out if it tasted wrong. It tasted like a cracker. A bit bland, a bit stale maybe, but unmistakably real food. He took another bite, then gave up on caution and ate the whole thing. Then he ate the cheese, which came in a can that opened with a strange key attached to its side. Then the dried meat. Then he found a large metal container that sloshed when he shook it, figured out how to open it, and drank water that tasted flat and metallic but wonderfully cold. His stomach, shocked by the sudden influx of food after days of nothing, cramped painfully. Caleb sat down in one of the strange chairs, which was surprisingly comfortable once he figured out how it supported his back, and waited for the nausea to pass. As he sat, his mind began to work through what he'd discovered. This place was from the future. That much seemed undeniable, however impossible. Someone had built this facility inside the mountain and stocked it with supplies dated 70 years ahead of his present. But why and how? The how seemed beyond his ability to even theorize, but the why nagged at him. You didn't build something this elaborate, this hidden, without a purpose. He looked around the room again, noticing details he'd missed before. The lights weren't just orange glass over a flame. They were solid, glowing from within, with no visible source of fuel. The walls met the floor at perfect angles with no gaps, no seams, as if the entire room had been cast as a single piece. And the air, now that he paid attention to it, didn't smell like enclosed space. It smelled clean, almost sterile, with a faint metallic tang that suggested it was being moved by some unseen mechanism. This wasn't just a room carved from rock. This was something built with technology and knowledge far beyond anything Caleb had ever encountered. It was a facility, a base of some kind, designed to operate independently of the outside world. But operate for what purpose? He stood and moved to the far side of the room, where another corridor led deeper into the complex. This one was wider than the first, with more of those orange lights and with symbols painted on the walls at intervals. Arrows, he realized. Directional markers pointing the way to different sections of the facility. One arrow pointed left with a symbol that might have meant sleeping quarters. It looked like a simplified bed. Another pointed right with a symbol that could have been supplies or storage. And straight ahead, the largest arrow bore a symbol he couldn't interpret at all, a circle with lines radiating from it. like a child's drawing of the sun, but more precise, more technical. Caleb chose the corridor leading straight ahead. Whatever that symbol meant, it seemed important. Besides, he'd come this far. Turning back now felt impossible, even though part of him screamed that he should grab some food, check on the donkey, and get out of this place before he discovered something he couldn't unknow. The corridor opened into another room, larger than the first. This one had more furniture, actual recognizable pieces this time, including what looked like a desk and several chairs arranged around a long table. But what caught Caleb's attention was the wall. One entire wall was covered in something he could only describe as pictures, but not like any pictures he'd seen before. They were in color, perfectly clear, and they showed people. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, all wearing identical clothing of a type Caleb had never encountered. He approached the wall slowly, examining the images. They weren't paintings or drawings. They were too perfect, too realistic, as if someone had captured the actual moment in time and pressed it onto paper. The people in the images wore uniforms. He recognized them as military uniforms, though the cut and style were foreign to him. And they stood in front of machines, buildings, and landscapes that belonged to no place or time Caleb knew. One image showed a man standing next to what could only be a flying machine, though it was enormous, made of metal, with wings fixed to its sides rather than flapping. Another showed a group of soldiers with weapons that looked nothing like rifles or pistols, but had the unmistakable air of military hardware. A third showed a building so tall it seemed to scrape the sky itself, hundreds of windows reflecting clouds. Caleb's breath came faster as he moved along the wall. Each image was more impossible than the last. Machines that defied understanding, structures that challenged belief, and people, always people, looking out from these frozen moments with expressions that were utterly human, even as they stood in utterly alien circumstances. At the end of the wall, a single image stood alone, larger than the others, and set in a simple black frame. It showed a massive explosion, a cloud of smoke and fire rising into the sky in the shape of a mushroom, dwarfing everything around it. Beneath the image, written in clear English, were the words, "Trinity Test, July 16, 1945. Caleb didn't understand what Trinity Test meant, but the date jumped out at him. 1945, 62 years in his future. And whatever had caused that explosion, it was something beyond his comprehension, something that suggested humanity would develop powers that rivaled the forces of nature itself. He backed away from the wall, his heart pounding. This place was showing him the future piece by piece. The food from the 1950s, the images from the 1940s, the technology that surrounded him. All of it was from a time he wouldn't live to see, showing him a world transformed by knowledge and capability he couldn't begin to understand. And yet, here he stood, a cowboy from 1883, inside a facility that shouldn't exist, eating food that hadn't been made yet, looking at pictures of events that hadn't happened. The impossibility of it threatened to overwhelm him, to send him running back up that corridor and out into the blizzard, where at least the world made sense even if it was trying to kill him. But he didn't run. Something kept him rooted in place, staring at that mushroom cloud, feeling the weight of unknown years pressing down on him. He thought of the donkey, wounded but determined, leading him through the storm to this exact place. He thought of the door opening at his touch, as if it had been waiting for him specifically. And he thought of that compass spinning wildly in his pocket, unable to find north in this place where normal rules didn't seem to apply. Whatever this place was, whatever purpose it served, Caleb had been meant to find it. He didn't understand how or why, but the certainty of it settled over him like a heavy cloak. The donkey hadn't led him here by accident. The door hadn't opened by chance. He was supposed to be here, supposed to see these things, supposed to discover whatever else lay deeper in this impossible facility. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and moved toward the next corridor. Behind him, the images on the wall bore silent witness to a future he couldn't imagine, but that already existed somehow. Waiting for time to catch up, the next corridor led Caleb deeper into the complex, the gentle downward slope continuing until he estimated he must be at least 100 feet below the mountain's surface. The air remained that same controlled temperature, neither warm nor cold, and those orange lights continued their regular pattern along the walls, casting everything in an amber glow that reminded him of sunset. Though it never changed in intensity, he passed several closed doors, each made of the same smooth metal as everything else, each marked with symbols he couldn't read. He tried the handle on one and found it locked or sealed, or simply wouldn't budge. The second door he tried opened with a soft click, revealing a small room filled with more of those metal cabinets. He glanced inside but didn't enter, content for now to continue his exploration of the main passages. The corridor eventually opened into a much larger space, and Caleb stopped in the doorway, trying to process what he was seeing. It was clearly designed as a communal area of some kind. Long metal tables ran the length of the room in neat parallel rows, each one flanked by those strange chairs with their ergonomic curves and dark padded seats. At the far end stood a counter with what looked like serving areas behind it, and beyond that he could see into a kitchen area equipped with machinery he had no names for. This was a mess hall. He recognized the basic purpose, even if the specifics were alien. This was where people ate, gathered, shared meals. The realization brought an unexpected wave of loneliness. How many people had sat at these tables? How many meals had been served here? And where were they all now? The facility felt utterly abandoned, yet preserved, as if everyone had simply walked out one day and never returned. Caleb moved into the room, his footsteps echoing off the high ceiling. The tables were clear of any clutter, wiped clean and waiting. He ran his hand along the surface of one, and his fingers came away dusty but not grimy. Whatever abandonment had befallen this place, it hadn't been recent. Decades, maybe. The dust was the fine kind that accumulated over years of still air, not the grit of weeks or months. He made his way to the kitchen area, stepping behind the counter. Here he found more of those cabinets, larger ones built into the walls. He opened them one by one, discovering an astonishing cache of supplies. Boxes and boxes of those green ration packages, stacked floor to ceiling in perfect order. Each box was labeled with codes and dates. 1952, 1953, 1954, on through the mid-1950s. Someone had stocked this place with enough food to feed an army for years. Caleb pulled down one of the boxes and carried it to the nearest table. His earlier meal had taken the edge off his hunger, but his body was demanding more, trying to make up for days of deprivation. He opened the box and found it packed with individual ration packages, each one complete with its own nested containers and accessories. He selected one at random and laid out its contents like a puzzle. Crackers in a sealed package, canned meat that opened with a clever little key built into the lid, chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper and something else, something slick and moisture-proof, a small packet labeled Coffee Instant that confused him until he opened it and smelled the familiar aroma. Powdered coffee. He'd heard of it but never seen it. And a white package that said cigarettes, though Caleb didn't smoke. What fascinated him most was the thoughtfulness of it all. Every element was designed to last, to remain edible for years or even decades. The packaging was ingenious, layers of material that kept air and moisture out. The food itself was engineered for preservation, dried, canned, or treated in ways that prevented spoiling. Whoever designed these rations had been planning for a long-term survival scenario, a situation where fresh food wouldn't be available and supplies would need to last indefinitely. Caleb ate slowly this time, not wanting to make himself sick again. The canned meat tasted salty and processed, nothing like fresh beef or venison, but it was protein and his body craved it. The crackers were bland but filling. The chocolate was surprisingly good, rich and sweet, melting on his tongue in a way that made him close his eyes with pleasure. He hadn't tasted chocolate in months, not since before the ranch was foreclosed. As he ate, he examined the ration package more closely. Every surface was covered in text, instructions, nutritional information, dates, codes. Most of it meant nothing to him, but some words stood out. Military appeared several times. U.S. Armed Forces was printed on one panel, and that date again stamped in multiple places. 1955, the United States Military. That's who had built this place. It made a certain kind of sense. The military always had resources, always had access to the latest technology and engineering. But it didn't explain the fundamental impossibility of a military base from 1955 existing in 1883. Time didn't work that way. The future couldn't reach back and plant itself in the past unless it could. Unless Caleb's understanding of how the world worked was simply wrong. He finished eating and gathered up the trash, unsure what to do with it. In the end, he stuffed it all back into the original box and set it aside. He'd figure out proper disposal later, after he understood more about this place. Returning to the main corridor, Caleb continued his exploration. He found a sign, an actual sign with English words, pointing to living quarters. He followed the arrow down a side passage and emerged into another section of the complex, this one lined with doors on both sides. He tried the first door and found it unlocked. Inside was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, containing a narrow bed, a small desk, a chair, and a metal locker built into the wall. Personal quarters. Sleeping rooms for the personnel who'd staffed this facility. Caleb stepped inside and closed the door behind him, needing a moment in an enclosed space. Something closer to normal human scale than the vast corridors and chambers he'd been traversing. The bed had a thin mattress on a metal frame, covered with folded grey blankets. Caleb sat on it and felt it give slightly, not comfortable exactly, but serviceable. The desk held nothing but a layer of dust. The locker was empty, except for a few metal hangers. Someone had cleaned out their personal effects when they left, taking everything that mattered. He noticed something on the desk's corner, a small rectangular object, dark and smooth. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. It was made of some kind of dense material, not metal, but not wood either, with a clear glass panel on one side and buttons on the other. A device of some kind, though its purpose eluded him. He tried pressing the buttons, but nothing happened. Dead or dormant or simply beyond his ability to activate, Caleb set the device back on the desk and stood. The room felt sad somehow, a space designed for human habitation, but stripped of humanity. He imagined someone living here, sleeping in that bed, working at that desk, hanging their uniform in that locker. A soldier, probably, stationed in this underground facility for reasons Caleb still didn't understand. What must it have been like, living in this artificial environment, cut off from sun and sky and the natural world? He left the room and checked several others along the corridor. They were all identical. Same bed, same desk, same locker, same essential loneliness. Some held small traces of former occupation. A book left on a shelf, its pages yellowed but readable. A photograph tacked to a wall, showing a family that Caleb didn't recognize. A pair of worn boots tucked under a bed. But most were empty, cleaned out and abandoned. At the end of the living quarters corridor, Caleb found a bathroom facility, and here the technology became even more baffling. Sinks with handles that, when he turned them experimentally, produced running water after a moment of gurgling in the pipes. Toilets of a design he'd never seen, with mechanisms that flushed when he pressed a lever. And showers, actual indoor showers with adjustable nozzles and what appeared to be hot and cold water controls. The water that came from the taps was cold, rust-colored at first, then running clear. Apparently some systems in the facility still functioned, drawing from underground sources or reserves built into the complex. Caleb washed his hands and face in one of the sinks, scrubbing away days of grime and sweat, watching the dirt swirl down the drain. The simple act of being clean felt like a luxury he'd almost forgotten. He caught his reflection in a piece of polished metal mounted above the sinks. Not quite a mirror, but reflective enough. The face looking back at him was haggard and hollow-eyed, beard unkempt, hair matted from days under his hat. But his eyes held something new. Not just exhaustion and defeat, but curiosity, wonder. A spark of something he'd thought he'd lost. This place, impossible as it was, had given him shelter and food. It had saved his life, but more than that, it had presented him with a mystery so profound that it pulled him out of his spiral of self-pity and failure. Whatever waited deeper in this facility, whatever secrets it held, Caleb suddenly wanted to know, needed to know. The man he'd been a few hours ago, trudging through the snow, waiting to die, had been ready to give up. But that man had never stood in a room from the future, never eaten food that wouldn't exist for decades, never washed his face with water pumped by impossible machinery. Caleb Stratton might be broke, failed and lost, but he wasn't dead yet. And this place, this impossible base buried in the mountain, held answers to questions that made his personal failure seem suddenly small and insignificant. He dried his hands on his coat and headed back to the main corridor. There was more to see, more to understand. The facility sprawled around him, a labyrinth of passages and rooms, each one potentially holding another piece of the puzzle. The orange lights led him onward, deeper into the mountain, deeper into the impossible. And Caleb followed them with something approaching eagerness. His father's compass might not work here, might spin uselessly, unable to find north, but Caleb didn't need it anymore. The path forward was clear enough. He just had to keep walking, keep discovering, keep piecing together the truth of this place and why. Of all the people in all the mountains, a wounded donkey had led him here specifically. That thought nagged at him as he walked, specifically. Not random chance, but deliberate intent. The more he saw of this facility, the more certain he became that nothing about his presence here was accidental. The deeper Caleb ventured into the facility, the more apparent it became that this was no simple storage depot or shelter. This was a command center, a place designed for long-term occupation by trained personnel. The corridors branched and intersected with military precision, each junction marked with signs in that clear, mechanically printed English that seemed both familiar and alien at once. He followed a passage marked Archives and Briefing, and found himself in a long, gallery-like corridor. Here the walls changed character. Instead of bare metal, they were covered with images, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows that stretched from floor to ceiling on both sides. Caleb slowed his pace, then stopped completely, his attention caught by the sheer scale of what he was seeing. These were photographs. He was certain of that now, having studied the images in the previous room. But these weren't formal portraits or carefully staged scenes. These were snapshots of war, battle, destruction on a scale that defied his understanding of conflict. The first section showed soldiers in trenches, their uniforms covered in mud, their faces hollow with exhaustion. The trenches themselves were unlike anything from the Civil War or the Indian campaigns Caleb had heard about. These were elaborate systems, zigzagging through devastated landscapes where not a single tree stood intact, where the earth itself looked tortured and dead. One image showed bodies, dozens of them, tangled in barbed wire, while smoke drifted across a hellish no-man's land. Text beneath the photo read, "Western Front, 1917. Caleb moved along the wall, unable to look away despite the horror of what he was seeing. The next section showed a different kind of warfare. Massive machines that could only be the flying contraptions he'd seen in earlier photos, but here they were, engaged in battle, smoke and fire trailing from their wings as they maneuvered through the sky. One remarkable image captured the moment of an explosion, a ship breaking apart in a harbor, water and fire erupting skyward. The caption said, "Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. He continued walking, his mind struggling to process the information. The wall was a timeline, he realized, a visual history of conflicts arranged chronologically. After the flying machines came images of soldiers wading through water toward beaches, of cities reduced to rubble, of tanks. He recognized them from illustrations he'd seen, so much larger and more fearsome than anything from his era. D-Day, Normandy, 1944 read one caption. Battle of Berlin, 1945 read another. Then came images that made even less sense. Not battles, but tests, explosions that dwarfed anything that came before. Mushroom clouds rising miles into the sky, their bases wider than entire towns. Bikini Atoll, 1946, said one. Nevada Test Site, 1951, said another. These weren't conventional explosions. Caleb had seen dynamite used to clear rocks, had witnessed black powder accidents. This was something different entirely, something that harnessed fundamental forces of nature itself. He reached the end of the photo gallery and found himself facing a large panel with text rather than images. It was titled Major Global Conflicts, 1914-1962, and below that, a list of wars, casualties, and outcomes that read like a prophecy of doom. World War I, 1914-1918, 15-20 million dead. World War II, 1939-1945, 70-85 million dead. Korean War, 1950-1953, 5 million dead. Caleb read the numbers 3 times, certain he must be misinterpreting them. But no, there they were, printed clearly, millions. Not thousands or tens of thousands like the Civil War he'd learned about as a boy, but millions upon millions. The entire population of the United States in his time was barely 50 million people. These wars, these future wars, had killed more than the entire population of his country, some of them twice over. He backed away from the wall, his chest tight. This was the future. This was what humanity had waiting for it. Not progress and enlightenment, but death on an industrial scale, weapons that could vaporize cities, conflicts that spanned entire continents and consumed generations. A doorway at the end of the gallery led to another room, smaller and quieter. Caleb entered and found himself in what could only be described as a library, though not like any library he'd ever seen. Instead of wooden shelves, there were metal racks holding boxes of files and folders. But one wall did hold books, hundreds of them, arranged by subject and date. Caleb approached the books, running his finger along their spines. Global Military Strategy, 1945-1960. Nuclear Weapons, A Technical History. The Cold War, Origins and Implications. Survival Planning for Underground Installations. He pulled down a volume at random. A thin book titled Newspaper Archives, 1914-1920, and opened it carefully. Inside were actual newspaper pages, preserved somehow, protected in clear sheets. The headlines jumped out at him. Archduke Ferdinand assassinated. Europe at war. Millions dead in trench warfare. Influenza epidemic sweeps globe. Armistice signed. War ends. Caleb sank into a nearby chair, the book open in his lap. He began to read, slowly at first, struggling with some of the language and references, but gradually piecing together a picture of the world to come. A world that would tear itself apart over ideologies and territories, that would invent weapons of such terrible efficiency that killing became an industrial process, that would harness the power of the atom itself and turn it into bombs that could erase cities in an instant. He read for what must have been hours, pulling down book after book, newspaper after newspaper. The story they told was consistent and horrifying. In 1914, barely 30 years from now, by Caleb's reckoning, a war would begin in Europe that would spread across the globe. The old empires would collapse. Millions would die in trenches and battlefields. And just as the world recovered, a second and even more terrible war would erupt, bringing with it horrors that included the deliberate murder of millions of civilians, cities burned to ash, and finally, the use of atomic weapons against Japan. The book spoke of a Cold War, a period of tension between the United States and a nation called the Soviet Union, during which both sides would build arsenals of nuclear weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth. This facility, Caleb understood with sudden clarity, was built for that Cold War. It was a bunker, a survival shelter, a place where military personnel could continue operations even if the surface world was reduced to radioactive wasteland. He set the books aside and pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to relieve the ache building behind them. The comfortable world he'd known, where the worst conflict was a range war between ranchers or tension with Indian tribes, was a fragile thing. Within his lifetime, if he lived a normal span, the world would transform into something almost unrecognizable. Machines would fly, weapons would kill millions, nations would rise and fall, and humanity would come perilously close to destroying itself completely. But he was sitting here, in 1883, inside a facility built in the 1950s or early 1960s, reading about events that hadn't happened yet. The impossibility of it hadn't diminished with familiarity. If anything, the more he learned about the future, the more impossible his presence here became. Caleb stood and walked to a large map mounted on one wall. It showed the world, but not the world he knew. Borders had changed. Countries had different names. The map was marked with symbols, red stars, black triangles, colored zones, and was labeled strategic nuclear targets. 1962, he traced his finger across the United States, finding Montana. There, in the western mountains, a small red circle was marked with text, too small to read from this distance. He leaned closer. Installation 7 Alpha, it said. Personnel 50, mission Strategic Command Continuity. This place had a designation, Installation 7 Alpha, and a mission. Caleb still didn't fully understand what Strategic Command Continuity meant, but the implications were clear enough. This bunker was designed to keep military operations running, even after a nuclear war. The people stationed here would survive underground, while the world above burned, maintaining the capability to coordinate whatever forces remained. 50 people. The facility had been designed for 50 personnel. Caleb had passed dozens of sleeping quarters, each one identical and empty. Had this place ever reached full staffing? Or had something prevented that? The dust suggested abandonment, but when? In the future that created it, or in his present where it waited like a time capsule? He returned to the books, this time looking for anything that might explain the mechanism of his presence here. How did a facility from the future exist in the past? The books on nuclear weapons and military strategy offered no answers. But he found a slim volume, its cover unmarked, sitting alone on a high shelf. He had to stand on a chair to reach it, and when he pulled it down, he saw that it was a journal, handwritten rather than printed. The cover page bore a title, Project Chronos, Temporal Anchor Initiative. 1961-1962, Caleb's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, but the content was fragmentary, as if whoever wrote it was working through problems in real time. He read slowly, struggling with technical terminology he didn't understand. But certain phrases jumped out. Time is not a river but a web, multiple. Timelines existing simultaneously, anchor. Points necessary to prevent cascade failure. Subjects must be selected from critical junctures, installation. 7 Alpha positioned at 1883 anchor point, and then, most significantly, subject arrival must appear natural. No direct intervention. Let the timeline itself guide them. Caleb closed the journal and set it carefully on the table. His arrival here wasn't an accident. Someone or something had arranged for him to find this place. The wounded donkey, the storm, his desperate circumstances, all of it had conspired to bring him to this exact location at this exact time. Not by force, but by circumstance, carefully orchestrated to seem like natural coincidence. But why him? Why a broke cowboy with nothing left to lose? What made Caleb Stratton significant enough to be drawn into whatever Project Chronos was attempting? He picked up the journal again, flipping to later entries. Most were too technical to pass, filled with equations and terminology that might as well be a foreign language. But near the end, he found a passage that stopped him cold. The 1883 subject must be motivated by desperation, but capable of reason. He must have the survival skills to endure, but also the curiosity to explore. Most importantly, he must be willing to sacrifice for a greater good, even if he doesn't understand it. The psychological profile suggests Caleb Stratton matches all parameters. His name, written in a journal dated 1961, in a hand that belonged to someone who wouldn't be born for another 50 years. They knew about him. They'd known he would come here. They'd planned for it, selected him, orchestrated his arrival. Caleb felt the weight of unseen forces pressing down on him. His life, his choices, perhaps even his failures, none of it had been truly his own. Someone from the future had reached back and placed their finger on the scales, nudging him toward this moment, toward this discovery. He should have been angry. He should have felt violated, manipulated, robbed of his autonomy. But instead, he felt something else. Purpose. For the first time in months, since losing the ranch and Sarah and everything that mattered, Caleb felt like his life meant something beyond his own survival. Whatever Project Kronos needed from him, whatever role he was meant to play, it was more important than his personal grievances. The facility hummed around him, its systems maintaining their eternal vigilance, waiting for a future that would eventually arrive. And Caleb Stratton, Cowboy from 1883, sat in a library from the 1960s, holding a journal that explained the impossible, and accepted that his life was no longer his own. He was an anchor point, a fixed moment in time, and everything that came next would depend on choices he hadn't even made yet. The journal had given Caleb a direction, even if it hadn't provided complete answers. Project Kronos, Temporal Anchor Initiative, Installation 7 Alpha. The words rolled through his mind as he made his way back to the main corridor, the journal tucked under his arm. He'd taken it without permission, but from whom would he be stealing? The facility was abandoned, its personnel absent for reasons he still didn't fully understand. The signs pointed him toward sections of the complex he hadn't yet explored. He passed doors marked communications, power generation, and water reclamation. Each represented a mystery, a system designed to keep this underground refuge functioning indefinitely. But his attention was drawn to a larger door at the end of the main corridor, one marked simply Command Center. This door was heavier than the others, with a wheel lock mechanism like something on a bank vault. Caleb grasped the wheel and turned. It resisted at first, then gave with a series of metallic clunks as internal mechanisms disengaged. He pulled, and the door swung inward on hinges that barely whispered despite their obvious weight. The room beyond took his breath away. It was vast, easily 40 feet across and 30 deep, with a ceiling that rose 2 stories above him. But it wasn't the size that stunned him. It was what filled the space. Machines, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, arranged in rows and stations throughout the room. Consoles with panels of buttons and switches, screens of dark glass set into metal frames, tangles of cables running between devices like mechanical veins. And covering one entire wall, a massive display showing what appeared to be a map of the world, divided into sections and zones, marked with symbols and text in multiple colors. Caleb stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Most of the machines were dark and silent, powered down or dead, but not all. As he moved deeper into the command center, he noticed that some screens still glowed faintly, cycling through displays of text and diagrams. And the wall map, that enormous representation of the globe, had lights that pulsed slowly in various locations, mostly in reds and yellows, concentrated in certain regions more than others. He approached the nearest active console, drawn by the glow of its screen. The display showed columns of numbers and abbreviations he didn't recognize, but at the top of the screen, updated every few seconds, was a clock. Not just any clock, but several clocks, each labeled with city names: Washington, D.C., Moscow, Beijing, London. The times were different for each, and Caleb realized he was looking at a global time display, showing what hour it was in different parts of the world simultaneously. Below the clocks, text scrolled slowly: Threat level DEFCON 2 and Strategic Systems Standby Mode. And last update, 10/15/1962, October 15th, 1962. Caleb did the math in his head. 79 years from now. This system was still receiving some kind of update or maintaining its last known state from a specific date in the future. A date that apparently represented a moment of high threat, whatever DEFCON 2 meant. He reached out hesitantly and touched one of the buttons on the console. Nothing happened. He tried another, then a switch. The screen flickered, and suddenly the display changed, showing a different set of information. Missile tracking system online, targets identified, 157, time to impact, NA, standby mode, countermeasure status, available. Caleb jerked his hand back as if the console had burned him. Missiles, nuclear missiles? He had to assume, given what he'd read in the library. This system tracked them, identified targets, calculated impacts. This was a weapons coordination system, designed to manage the apocalypse those books had described. He moved to another console, this one with a larger screen, and what looked like a seat designed for an operator. The screen showed a map of the United States, overlaid with concentric circles radiating from various points. Each circle was labeled with numbers. Blast radius 5 miles, severe damage 12 miles, fallout zone 50 miles. The points from which the circles originated were marked as probable target and included major cities: New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. This was a map of destruction, a projection of what a nuclear attack on the United States would look like. Each circle representing a weapon, each weapon representing hundreds of thousands of deaths. The clinical precision of it made Caleb's stomach turn. Someone had sat here and calculated death with mathematical accuracy, reducing the end of the world to a series of measurements and probabilities. He turned away from that console and found himself facing the large wall display. Up close, he could see it was made of thousands of small lights arranged to form a map, each light capable of changing color or intensity. Sections of the map glowed in different shades. The United States and Western Europe were marked in blue. The Soviet Union, a nation that covered an enormous swath of Asia, glowed red. China was orange. Various other nations showed different colors, presumably indicating alliances or threat levels. Thin lines connected certain points, arcing across oceans and continents. These were trajectory lines, Caleb realized. The paths missiles would take from launch sites to targets. He counted them, tracing the lines with his eyes, and stopped when he reached 50. 50 lines between the Soviet Union and the United States. And those were just the ones displayed. The books had mentioned arsenals in the thousands. Near the bottom of the map, a text panel provided context. Cuban Missile Crisis. Status critical. Soviet missiles detected in Cuba, U.S. response, naval blockade. Probability of nuclear exchange, 47%. Last update, October 15th, 1962. The date again. October 15th, 1962. Something had happened on that date, something critical enough that the facility's systems still referenced it. A crisis over Soviet missiles in Cuba, whatever and wherever that was. A crisis that had a calculated 47% probability of resulting in nuclear war. Caleb moved along the wall, examining other panels and displays. One showed a list of facilities like this one, scattered across the United States and labeled with alphanumeric designations. Installation 7 Alpha was just one of dozens, each one positioned to survive nuclear attack and maintain command capability. Another panel displayed supply inventories, food, water, medical supplies, fuel, all calculated to support 50 personnel for an extended period. The numbers suggested years, possibly decades of self-sufficiency. He found a chair at what appeared to be the central command station and sank into it, overwhelmed by the scale of what he was seeing. This entire complex was built around a single assumption: that humanity would develop weapons capable of destroying itself, would position those weapons in a hair-trigger standoff, and would eventually possibly use them. The men who built this place expected the world to end. They'd prepared for it, calculated it, created underground refuges where survivors could wait out the radioactive storms and try to rebuild whatever remained, and they'd done something else. something the journal hinted at but didn't fully explain. They'd reached back in time, created anchor points, selected individuals to serve some purpose in preventing or managing the catastrophe. Caleb was one of those individuals, chosen, placed, guided to this exact location at this exact moment in history. But for what purpose? What could a cowboy from 1883 possibly do that would matter to events in 1962? How could his presence here, in this abandoned command center, change anything about a future that lay nearly 80 years ahead? He leaned back in the chair and noticed something he'd missed before. Above the central command station, mounted prominently where an operator would see it immediately, was a plaque. Polished brass, engraved with text, Installation 7 Alpha Command Center, dedicated to the preservation of human civilization, in the hope that wisdom prevails before necessity demands it. May those who occupy this station never need use its systems. Caleb read the inscription 3 times. It was a prayer, essentially, in hope that all this preparation, all this calculation of death and destruction would prove unnecessary, that humanity would step back from the brink before it was too late. But the books suggested otherwise. They documented a history of increasing militarization, of tensions rising rather than falling, of weapons proliferating rather than being dismantled. The Cold War, as they called it, was anything but cold. It was a war fought with the constant threat of annihilation, a standoff where both sides held guns to each other's heads and dared the other to flinch. A sound made Caleb jump. A soft electronic tone, polite but insistent. One of the active consoles was flashing, drawing attention to something on its screen. Caleb approached cautiously and read the message. System diagnostic required. Temporal anchor status. Pending verification. Subject Caleb Stratton. Please proceed to Sector 7C authorization code. Required his name again. The system knew he was here. More than that, it was expecting him, waiting for him to take some action. Sector 7C. He'd seen signs pointing to numbered sectors throughout the complex, but hadn't paid close attention to them. Now, it seemed important. The message included a map, a simplified diagram of the facility with a route highlighted from the command center to the indicated sector. It wasn't far, just down 2 corridors and through a security door. The map showed that Sector 7C was labeled Temporal Operations. Caleb looked around the command center one last time. The machines hummed softly, their lights pulsing in patient rhythm, waiting for operators who might never come, or who would come 80 years from now, in a future Caleb couldn't imagine, to face a crisis he'd only read about in books. But somehow, impossibly, his actions now would affect that future. The journal had said as much. He was an anchor point, a fixed moment in time that everything else pivoted around. He stood, tucked the journal more securely under his arm, and headed for the door. The command center had shown him the stakes, the entire world balanced on the edge of destruction. Whatever waited in Sector 7C, whatever Project Kronos required of him, it was connected to preventing that destruction, or at least managing it. His hand went to his pocket, touching his father's compass out of habit. The brass was warm from his body heat, familiar in a way nothing else in this facility could be. 3 generations of Stratton men had carried that compass, had used it to find their way through unknown territory. Now Caleb was in territory more unknown than any of them could have imagined, guided not by magnetic north, but by machines that thought and systems that spoke, pulled toward a destiny he'd never chosen but somehow couldn't refuse. He left the command center, the door swinging shut behind him with a pneumatic hiss, and followed the signs toward Sector 7C, toward the heart of Project Kronos, toward whatever truth waited there, impossible and necessary and terrifying. The lights guided him forward, and Caleb walked toward them, a man out of time on a mission he didn't yet understand, but couldn't turn away from. Sector 7C lay deeper in the complex than Caleb had yet ventured. The corridors here felt different, narrower, more utilitarian, with fewer of the amenities he'd seen in the living areas and mess hall. These were working spaces, technical areas where the facility's most critical systems operated. The signs changed from English to alphanumeric codes, presumably designations that meant something to the personnel who'd worked here, but were meaningless to Caleb. The security door at the sector entrance stood partially open, its locking mechanism disengaged or possibly disabled. Caleb pushed it wider and stepped through into a dim hallway lit by only a few functioning lights. The temperature dropped noticeably here, making him pull his coat tighter despite the hours he'd spent in the facility's controlled environment. He followed the corridor to its end and found a heavy door marked simply 7C1, Temporal Operations, Authorized Personnel Only. The warning meant nothing to him now. If the systems had called him here, if his name was in their databases, then presumably he was authorized whether anyone else agreed or not. This door required more than a simple handle. A panel beside it held a grid of buttons marked with numbers 0 through 9, clearly some kind of lock that required a code. But as Caleb approached, the panel lit up green and the door clicked open without him touching anything. The facility recognized him, granted him access. That should have been reassuring, but instead sent a chill down his spine. How deeply had these people from the future embedded his presence into their systems? The room beyond was smaller than he'd expected, more like an office than an operations center. Filing cabinets lined one wall, a desk sat in the center, and what looked like a more compact version of the command center's displays occupied another wall. But this display was different. Instead of maps and missile trajectories, it showed what appeared to be a timeline, a horizontal line stretching across multiple screens with dates marked along its length and various points highlighted in different colors. Caleb approached the desk first. Papers lay spread across its surface, held down by a coffee cup that still contained the dried dregs of whatever had been in it. The top paper was a roster, a list of names under the header, Project Kronos Personnel Installation 7 Alpha. He scanned the names, noting the ranks beside them. Colonel Morrison, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Chen, Communications, Sergeant Brooks, Security. On and on. 50 names total, each one representing a person who'd been assigned to this facility. But it was the second document that stopped his heart. Another roster, this one titled Temporal Anchor Subjects, Primary Candidates. The list was shorter, maybe a dozen names, each followed by a date and location. Sarah Chen, 1847, Oregon. Trail, Marcus Okafor, 1776, Philadelphia, Isabella Romano, 1692, Salem, Caleb Stratton, 1883, Montana Territory. There he was. His full name, his exact year, his location, not approximate but precise, as if whoever compiled this list had known exactly where and when to find him. Below his name, additional notation. Status, active. Anchor point, 1883. 10-1. Mission phase. Discovery. Psychological profile. Suitable motivation index. High. Success probability. 78%. Caleb pulled out the desk chair and sat heavily, the paper trembling in his hands. They'd profiled him, analyzed him, calculated his probability of success at whatever task they needed him to perform, and they'd concluded he was suitable, motivated, likely to succeed. It was like reading his own obituary written by strangers, except worse, because it was a prediction of his future behavior, a determination of his worth based on criteria he didn't understand. He set that paper aside and picked up the next one, a longer document with the header Temporal Anchor Initiative, Operational Overview. He began reading, struggling through technical jargon and scientific terminology, but gradually assembling a picture of Project Kronos' true purpose. The discovery of temporal field manipulation in 1958 opened unprecedented possibilities for influencing historical outcomes. However, direct intervention creates paradoxes that destabilize timeline integrity. The Anchor Initiative circumvents this limitation by identifying individuals at critical historical junctures and creating conditions that draw them to prepositioned resources without direct temporal insertion. Anchor subjects must be native to their timeline. They must arrive at their designated facility through apparently natural circumstances. Once present, they can be provided with information and tools that allow them to influence future events in ways that preserve timeline stability while achieving desired outcomes. Installation 7 Alpha serves as the 1883 anchor point. Subject Caleb Stratton has been identified as optimal for this location and date due to his skill set, psychological profile, and circumstances. His arrival, while appearing coincidental, has been facilitated through carefully orchestrated events. Caleb stopped reading, his mind reeling. Facilitated. They'd facilitated his arrival. The business partner who'd swindled him. Had that been arranged? Sarah leaving him? Had they somehow caused that? The storm that drove him into the mountains, the wounded donkey that led him here, all of it orchestrated by people who wouldn't be born for decades? He flipped through more papers, finding mission briefings and technical specifications, but also personal files. His personal file. Someone had compiled a dossier on Caleb Stratton, tracking his life from birth to the present moment. They knew about his father's ranch, his marriage to Sarah, his failed business venture. They knew his skills: horseback riding, tracking, basic carpentry, firearms proficiency. They knew his weaknesses: pride, stubbornness, tendency toward self-isolation when hurt, and they knew his pain. There was a psychological evaluation dated, absurdly, 1961, written by someone named Dr. Patricia Hernandez, analyzing Caleb's mental state at age 42. It described him as resilient despite recent trauma, capable of rational decision-making, under pressure, and likely to respond to mission parameters with dedication once purpose is established. The evaluation concluded, Subject Stratton's recent losses have created an ideal psychological state for anchor activation. He retains the survival instinct and technical competence necessary for mission success, but his personal attachments have been severed, reducing the risk of distraction or deviation from assigned parameters. Recommendation: proceed with activation sequence October 21st, 1883, October 21st, 1883. Today, they'd timed everything down to the specific day. The storm, the donkey, his arrival, all on schedule, all predicted, all arranged. Caleb stood and walked to the timeline display. Up close, he could see it more clearly. The horizontal line represented history from approximately 1600 to 2000, with various points marked in different colors. Red points appeared to indicate major conflicts. He recognized dates from the books he'd read. Blue points were labeled anchor activations, and there were dozens of them scattered throughout the timeline. Green points said timeline corrections, with notation about prevented conflicts or altered outcomes. His own anchor point, 1883, glowed blue in the center of the display. Lines extended from it, one backward to earlier anchor points, others forward to future events. The lines formed a network, a web of causality connecting different moments in time. Caleb's actions in 1883 would apparently affect events in the early 1900s, which would in turn influence the world wars, which would ultimately impact the Cold War itself. He traced the lines with his finger, following one strand forward through time. It passed through 1914, through 1929, through 1939, each time touching a red conflict marker or a green correction marker. Finally, it reached 1962 and converged with dozens of other lines at a point labeled Critical Juncture, Cuban Missile Crisis. That date again. October 1962. The moment the command center systems still referenced when the world came closest to nuclear war. Every anchor point, every temporal correction, every carefully orchestrated historical intervention apparently led to that moment. Project Kronos wasn't trying to prevent the Cold War. It was trying to ensure humanity survived it. Caleb returned to the desk and found another document. This one a handwritten letter on official letterhead, to anchor subject, Caleb Stratton, from Colonel Robert Morrison. Installation 7 Alpha Commander date, January 15th, 1962, Mr. Stratton. If you're reading this, then Project Kronos has succeeded in bringing you to our facility. I'm writing this letter 80 years before you'll read it, which still feels impossible even after 3 years of working on this project. You deserve to know the truth, though I'm not sure how much of it you'll believe. We've reached back through time not to change history, but to preserve it. The timeline we exist in, the one where humanity survives the 20th century, is fragile. Our calculations show dozens of points where small variations could cascade into catastrophic outcomes. Nuclear war, biological weapons released accidentally, technological advances that come too quickly for social structures to adapt. Your role is simpler than you might fear. We don't need you to prevent wars or assassinate future tyrants. We need you to be an anchor, a fixed point of stability that prevents timeline degradation. Your presence in our facility in 1883, your interaction with our systems, your very existence as a verified historical figure creates a stable node around which other events can safely unfold. But there's more. Inside this facility, you'll find instructions for a task. A simple mechanical action that requires no special knowledge or skill. Completing this task will ensure the timeline remains stable, that all the anchor points function correctly, and that humanity reaches 1962 with the wisdom to step back from the brink. I know you've suffered losses. I know you feel your life has been a failure. But I promise you, Caleb Stratton, your life matters more than you can possibly imagine. You are essential. You are needed, and you are exactly the right person for this moment. Trust the facility, trust the systems, and when the time comes, trust yourself to do what's necessary. Respectfully, Colonel Robert Morrison. Caleb read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket next to his father's compass. Morrison's words should have been comforting, but they raised more questions than they answered. A simple mechanical task. Instructions he'd find somewhere in the facility. Actions that would stabilize the entire timeline. He looked at the timeline display again, at the web of connections spreading across decades, at the anchor points and corrections and critical junctures. His presence here wasn't about changing history. It was about ensuring history happened correctly. That the path from 1883 to 1962 remained stable enough for humanity to survive its own worst impulses. But what about his choices? What about free will? If every major event in his life had been orchestrated to bring him here, if his failures and losses were all part of some greater plan, then what did that mean for his agency, his autonomy, his very identity as an individual? Caleb pressed his palms against the desk, steadying himself. The truth was complicated. Yes, external forces had influenced his path, but he'd still made choices. He'd chosen to trust Wheaton despite Sarah's warnings. He'd chosen to follow the donkey instead of continuing toward the mining camp. He'd chosen to enter the facility instead of turning back to the storm. Even manipulated, even guided, he'd still decided, and he could decide now. Morrison's letter asked him to trust, to follow instructions, to complete a task. But Caleb could refuse. He could walk out of this facility, return to the mountains, live out whatever life remained to him without playing his designated role. Except he wouldn't. Deep down, beneath the anger at being manipulated and the fear of what lay ahead, Caleb knew he would see this through, not because he had to, but because it mattered. Because if there was even a chance that his actions here could prevent the wars he'd read about, could help humanity survive the nuclear age, then how could he walk away? His father had given him a compass and told him a man needs to know which direction he's heading. Right now, despite all the impossible circumstances, Caleb knew his direction, forward, deeper into Project Kronos, toward whatever task waited for him. Toward a purpose larger than his own life, his own failures, his own small concerns. He gathered up the papers, his file, Morrison's letter, the anchor point documentation, and left Sector 7C. The systems had called him here to show him the truth. Now they would show him what he needed to do. The corridor lights seemed brighter as he walked, as if the facility approved of his decision. Or maybe that was just his imagination, projecting purpose onto mechanical systems. Either way, Caleb Stratton moved forward. An anchor point activated, a man out of time ready to fulfill a destiny he'd never chosen, but now embraced. The facility seemed to guide Caleb through its corridors, each sign and marker pointing him onward with increasing specificity. He passed through sections he'd already explored, seeing them now with different eyes. The mess hall where he'd eaten rations wasn't just a dining area. It was a survival cache designed to outlast decades. The living quarters weren't just bedrooms. They were cells where people would wait out the apocalypse. Everything had dual purposes, hidden meanings, layers he was only beginning to understand. A new sign caught his attention, one he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't been lit earlier. Secure storage, temporal assets. An arrow pointed down a side corridor that branched off from the main passage. Caleb followed it, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The corridor terminated at a door unlike any he'd seen in the facility. Where others were plain metal, this one had a panel with what appeared to be a screen and a handprint outline etched into a glass plate. Above the screen, text flashed, "Biometric verification required." Caleb stared at the handprint outline, uncertain. But he'd come this far, and the systems had acknowledged him at every turn. He placed his hand on the glass plate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the glass beneath his palm grew warm, and thin lines of light traced the contours of his hand. Not just his palm, but each finger, each crease and line of his skin. The screen flickered, showing text, "Analyzing subject Caleb Stratton. DNA match confirmed. Temporal signature 1883. Access granted." DNA. Another word he didn't know but could guess at, something unique to him. Something that identified him beyond simple appearance. The facility wasn't just recognizing him. It was verifying him at a level more fundamental than names or faces. The door unsealed with a hiss of escaping air pressure, then slid sideways into the wall. Beyond lay a small room, barely 10 feet square, with walls lined with locked cabinets and a central pedestal holding a single metal box. The box was perhaps a foot long and half as wide, made of brushed steel with a small plaque on its lid, "For Caleb Stratton, temporal anchor. 1883 to be opened. October 21st, 1883, contents mission critical." Caleb approached the pedestal slowly, reverently, as if the box might explode or vanish if he moved too quickly. His hand trembled as he reached for the lid. It opened easily, unlocked, waiting for him. Inside, nestled in foam padding, sat 3 items. First, a key. Not a modern key like those he'd seen in the facility, but an old-fashioned brass key of the type used in 1883, worn smooth with age, with an ornate head and a simple shaft. It looked like it belonged to a safe or strongbox, the kind his father had owned to store important documents. Second, a thick envelope made of heavy paper, sealed with wax and marked with his name in flowing script. Not printed by a machine, but written by hand, with care and precision. Third, a small metal device about the size of his fist, cylindrical with brass fittings on both ends and a series of dials around its middle. It was beautiful in its way, mechanical and precise, with craftsmanship that reminded him of expensive pocket watches. One end had a threaded fitting, as if it was meant to attach to something else. Caleb picked up the envelope first and broke the wax seal. Inside were several pages of paper, the first covered in that same careful handwriting. "Dear Caleb, you're holding a key that shouldn't exist and reading words written decades before I'm born." The paradox of that should make your head spin. But by now you've seen enough impossible things that maybe you're getting used to it. I'm writing this in January 1962. Outside this facility, the world is locked in a standoff between superpowers armed with enough nuclear weapons to end civilization. In 9 months, we'll face the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days when the fate of humanity will hang by a thread. We'll survive it, but barely, and only because certain conditions are met. Conditions that depend on you. The device in this box is called a Kronos anchor. It's simple in concept but profound in effect. When activated at specific coordinates on October 22, 1883, it creates a temporal stabilization field. Think of it as a nail hammered into the fabric of time. Holding this moment in place, no matter what changes try to ripple backward from the future. Without this anchor, timeline degradation accelerates. Small variations compound. Events shift. The careful balance we've maintained through Project Kronos unravels. Our models show a cascade effect leading to nuclear war in 1962. Not the close call we actually experienced, but an actual exchange of weapons that ends modern civilization. Your role is crucial but simple. Take this device to the coordinates listed in the attached instructions. Install it according to the specifications. Activate it at the precise time indicated. The device will do the rest, operating silently for the next 80 years, maintaining timeline stability until it's no longer needed. But I need to be honest with you about the cost. Once you activate the anchor, you can't stay in this facility. The temporal field is incompatible with your continued presence here. You'll need to return to your own time, to your own life, carrying only what you can reasonably explain, having found in the mountains. The knowledge you've gained here must remain yours alone. If you speak of what you've seen, you risk creating the very instabilities we're trying to prevent. You'll go back to being Caleb Stratton, broke cowboy, with nothing to show for your time here, except perhaps some salvaged supplies you could claim to have found in an old prospector's cache. Your sacrifice will be known to no one. History won't record your name as a hero. You'll live and die in obscurity, while the world you saved continues on, never knowing how close it came to a different, darker path. I wish I could offer you more. I wish I could tell you that you'll be remembered, celebrated, rewarded. But the nature of temporal work is that the best outcomes are the ones that appear inevitable, where no one suspects any intervention occurred. What I can tell you is this: you matter. Your life, which seemed to you like a string of failures, has been preparation for this moment. The skills you learned ranching, the resilience you developed during hard times, the solitude that allowed you to survive alone in the mountains, all of it was necessary for you to reach this facility and complete this mission. The key in this box opens a cache I've prepared for your return journey. Coordinates are included. Inside you'll find supplies, gold coins dated appropriately for 1883, and documents that will help you start over. Not a fortune, but enough to give you a second chance at building a life. Complete your mission, Caleb. Activate the anchor. Save a future you'll never see. Then live whatever life you can in your own time, knowing that millions of people will exist because you were brave enough to do what needed doing. History won't remember you. But I will. We all will. Every person working on Project Kronos. We'll raise a glass to Caleb Stratton every October 22nd, the man who saved the world by hammering a nail into time. With deepest respect and gratitude, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Project Kronos, Psychological Operations. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his emotions cycling from disbelief to anger to a strange, hollow acceptance. They were asking him to save the world, and then go back to being nobody, to know the truth and never speak it, to sacrifice without recognition, to matter without being remembered. He picked up the device, the Kronos anchor, and examined it more closely. The instructions were detailed, with diagrams showing how to install it at the designated location, a spot high in the mountains about 3 miles from the facility entrance. The installation process looks straightforward. Attach the device to exposed bedrock using pitons and brackets included. Adjust the dials to specific settings. Insert the brass key. Turn it at the exact moment specified. The moment specified was 3:47 p.m. on October 22nd, 1883. Tomorrow, by his reckoning. He'd spent roughly a day inside the facility, though his sense of time had become fuzzy with the constant artificial light and lack of natural cues. The instructions noted that he'd need to leave the facility by dawn to reach the coordinates with time to spare. Caleb set the device down and picked up the key, feeling its weight in his palm. This simple piece of brass was essential to humanity's survival, which seemed absurd. But then, everything about his situation was absurd. A broke cowboy from 1883, holding technology from 1962, reading instructions that would affect events in between, all in a facility that existed somehow in both past and future simultaneously. He looked at the final page of instructions, which detailed the cache location. It was marked on a hand-drawn map showing landmarks he recognized: a distinctive rock formation, a stream junction, a stand of dead pines. The cache contained the supplies Hernandez had mentioned, enough to let him start over, maybe even go to Denver and find Sarah, tell her he had money now and prospects, and no, he couldn't tell her, couldn't tell anyone. The letter was clear about that. The knowledge stayed with him, a secret he'd carry alone until he died. Even Sarah, if he found her again, would never know what he'd done, or why he disappeared into the mountains that October, or how he'd miraculously come back with enough money to start fresh. Caleb carefully repacked the box. The key, the device, the instructions, the letter. He closed the lid and lifted the box, surprised by how light it was. The weight of the world, reduced to a few pounds of metal and paper. He left the secure storage room and made his way back to the living quarters. In one of the rooms he'd explored earlier, he found a heavy canvas pack, military issue, still functional despite the dust. He loaded it with supplies, ration packs, a good knife, matches sealed in waterproof containers, a wool blanket, a first aid kit whose contents he barely understood but figured might be useful. Then he added the metal box containing the Kronos anchor, wrapping it carefully in an extra shirt he found in one of the lockers. The pack was heavy but manageable. He'd carried heavier loads during his ranching days. His body, despite the recent hardship, remembered how to bear weight and keep moving. Before leaving the living quarters, Caleb stopped at a mirror, a real one this time, not polished metal, and looked at himself. The face staring back was still haggard, still showed the marks of hard living and recent starvation. But the eyes were different. They held purpose now, determination, something beyond mere survival instinct. "You're about to save the world," he told his reflection. "And no one will ever know." The reflection didn't answer, didn't reassure him. It just looked back, a middle-aged cowboy with nothing to his name except a mission he hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. Caleb shouldered the pack and headed back through the facility toward the entrance. He passed the mess hall, the library, the command center, each space now familiar yet still mysterious. This place had been his shelter, and his revelation had shown him wonders and horrors in equal measure. In another life, he might have been happy to stay here forever, living in this bubble outside of normal time. But that wasn't his role. His role was to leave, to return to the cold and the struggle and the mundane difficulties of 1883, carrying a secret that could never be shared. The corridor leading to the entrance stretched ahead, those orange lights marking the path. Somewhere up there, beyond the steel door, winter waited. And beyond winter, the rest of his life, however long it might be, shadowed by knowledge he couldn't use and marked by actions no one would recognize. But first, he had to activate the anchor, had to climb to the coordinates specified, install the device, turn the key at the precise moment, had to complete the mission. Caleb took a deep breath and started walking toward the entrance, toward the cold, toward tomorrow, and everything it demanded of him. Behind him, the facility hummed on, maintaining its systems, waiting for its proper time, secure in the knowledge that its anchor point was activated and functioning. The impossible had become mundane. The future had reached back and touched the past. And Caleb Stratton, broke Cowboy, was the bridge between them, the fixed point around which time itself pivoted. He just had to make it through one more day. One more mission, one more impossible task. Then he could go back to being nobody. Nobody who'd saved everyone. Caleb found the donkey where he'd left it, still lying in the entrance corridor, but no longer gasping with exhaustion. The animal lifted its head as he approached, and to Caleb's amazement, its eyes were clear and alert. The wound on its flank, which had looked mortal just hours ago, seemed less severe now, or perhaps that had been his tired perception exaggerating its condition. Either way, the donkey was alive and, remarkably, seemed to be recovering. "You're tougher than you looked," Caleb said, kneeling beside the animal. He ran his hand along its neck, feeling the pulse strong and steady. "Think you can make another trip out there?" "I've got work to do, and I'll admit, having company would help." The donkey's ear flicked toward him, the universal signal that it was listening. Caleb took that as agreement, or at least acceptance. He'd need to leave at first light to make the coordinates by the specified time, which meant he had hours yet to prepare. Hours to spend in the warmth and safety of the facility before venturing back into the Montana winter. He returned to the living quarters and found a room with a functioning shower. Real hot water, heated by systems he didn't understand, but was grateful for nonetheless. He stood under the spray longer than strictly necessary, letting the heat soak into muscles that had been cold and tense for days. The simple luxury of being clean, truly clean for the first time in weeks, was almost enough to make him weep. After drying off, he searched through the lockers until he found military winter gear sized roughly for his frame. The clothing was unlike anything from his era. Synthetic materials that repelled water, insulation that trapped heat without bulk, layers designed to be worn together for maximum warmth. He dressed in long underwear that felt like silk, but was labeled as some material called thermal synthetic, then added wool blend pants and a shirt, then a heavy jacket with more pockets than he knew what to do with. Boots were more difficult. The military issue was too large for his feet, designed for soldiers who apparently came in standardized sizes. But he found a pair in a storage room that were closer to correct, and with extra wool socks, they were manageable. Better than his old boots, which had been held together more by faith than leather at this point. In the supply rooms, Caleb assembled a proper winter survival kit. A military sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, which compressed down to a surprisingly small bundle. More ration packs than he could possibly eat in a week, but weight wasn't a major concern. The 3-mile journey to the coordinates was manageable. A first aid kit with supplies he recognized, and many he didn't. Waterproof matches. A compass that actually worked, unlike his father's, which still spun uselessly inside the facility. He found a coil of rope, strong synthetic material that felt like nothing he'd handled before. Climbing equipment, carabiners, pitons, a hammer. The instructions for installing the Kronos anchor specified that he'd need to secure it to rock face at a specific location, and these tools would be essential for that task. In one storage room, he discovered something remarkable, a firearm. Not a rifle or pistol from his era, but a compact military-issue weapon labeled M1 carbine. It was smaller than a full rifle, with a magazine that loaded from underneath and a design that suggested semi-automatic fire. Boxes of ammunition sat beside it, each round precisely manufactured and sealed against moisture. Caleb hefted the carbine, getting a feel for its balance. He was proficient with firearms, any rancher had to be, and this one, while more advanced, followed principles he understood. He loaded a magazine according to instructions printed on the box, then added the carbine and extra ammunition to his growing pile of supplies. The facility had given him everything he needed, not just for the mission, but for survival after, for starting over. In addition to the supplies Hernandez mentioned in her letter, he was now equipped like no cowboy in history had ever been. When he returned to civilization, he'd have to be careful about what he showed, what he used. But in the mountains, alone with just himself and the donkey, he could move through winter conditions that would kill a normal man. As the hours passed, Caleb returned repeatedly to the command center, drawn by the timeline display and the weight of what he was about to do. He studied the web of connections, the anchor points scattered through history, the critical junctures where small actions prevented catastrophic outcomes. His anchor, 1883, was one point among many, but the lines extending from it touched dozens of future events. He traced one line forward and found it connected to a point in 1914, labeled Temporal Correction, Archduke's Route Modified. Had another anchor subject influenced the assassination that started World War I? Not prevented it. The book showed the war still happened, but perhaps changed some detail that made the outcome different, better, less catastrophic than it might have been. Another line reached 1945, converging with the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. A green marker indicated timeline stabilized, war ended, further use prevented. Without Project Kronos, would the nuclear age have begun differently? Would more bombs have been dropped? Would the arms race have spiraled out of control earlier, leading to catastrophe before humanity developed the wisdom to step back from the brink? He couldn't know for certain. The command center showed results, but not the detailed mechanisms. But the pattern was clear. Small interventions at critical moments. Actions that appeared natural and coincidental, but were actually carefully planned. All working together to guide humanity through its darkest century toward survival. And now he was part of that pattern. His action tomorrow would stabilize the timeline, ensure the anchor points functioned correctly, preserve the path that led to 1962 and beyond. No pressure, he thought with grim humor. Just the fate of millions, depending on you turning a key at the right moment. In one of the command center's side rooms, he found something unexpected. A recording device. It looked similar to the screens and consoles throughout the facility, but was specifically designed for capturing audio messages. Instructions on the wall explained its use for personnel records and temporal messages. Caleb stared at the device for a long moment, then made a decision. He activated it according to the instructions, pressing buttons that caused indicator lights to glow, and waited for the prompt that said, "Recording. My name is Caleb Stratton," he began, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "It's October 21st, 1883, or maybe early on the 22nd. I've lost track of time in here. I'm recording this because I want someone to know what happened, even if that someone won't hear it for decades." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was ready to die in the mountains." That's the truth. I'd lost everything, my ranch, my wife, my sense of purpose. I was just walking through snow, waiting for the cold to take me. Then a wounded donkey led me to an impossible door, and I found this place. Installation 7 Alpha, a military facility from the future, buried in the Montana mountains in my present. I've learned things no man from 1883 should know. Seen pictures of wars that haven't happened yet. Read about weapons that can destroy entire cities. Eaten food sealed in packages that won't be manufactured for another 70 years. It should be impossible. It is impossible. But here I am. Tomorrow I'm going to install a device called a Kronos anchor. The instructions say it will stabilize the timeline, prevent something called cascade effects that could lead to nuclear war. I don't understand the science. I barely understand the words. But I understand the stakes. If I don't do this, millions of people die who should have lived. Children who should grow old never get born. The future I've read about, terrible as it sometimes is, doesn't happen at all. Something worse takes its place, so I'll do it. I'll carry that device to the coordinates, install it according to the specifications, turn the key at 3:47 p.m. exactly. And then I'll go back to being Caleb Stratton, broke cowboy, and I'll never tell anyone what I did or what I know. That's the cost. Secrecy, anonymity, dying someday with the truth locked inside me. He took a breath, surprised by the emotion welling up in his chest. I want someone to know it mattered, that I mattered. Not for myself, I've made peace with obscurity. But for everyone who walked through their life, never knowing how close they came to not existing at all. I'll be one of them after tomorrow. Just another person living in a world I helped save, and I'll never speak of it. And that's how it should be. If someone's listening to this in the future, Colonel Morrison, Dr. Hernandez, whoever you are, thank you for the second chance. The supplies and the gold you left in that cache, that's more than I deserve. I'll use it to build something good, something my father would have been proud of. Maybe I'll find Sarah again. Maybe I'll start over somewhere new. Either way, I'll live the rest of my life knowing I did something that mattered, even if I'm the only one who knows it. The facility systems are still running. The lights are on, the displays are active. The command center is waiting for the crew that'll arrive in 80 years. I hope they appreciate what they have. I hope they understand the importance of what they're doing. And I hope, when October 1962 comes around and the world faces its crisis, the work I'm doing tomorrow helps them make the right choices. Caleb paused, then added, I came into these mountains ready to die. I'm leaving tomorrow ready to live. Whatever else happens, Project Kronos gave me that. Purpose, direction, a reason to keep going. Thank you for that. And I hope, his voice cracked slightly, I hope I don't let you down. He stopped the recording, watching the indicator light fade. The message was stored somewhere in the facility systems, waiting for someone 80 years hence to discover it. Or maybe no one would ever find it. Maybe it would sit in digital storage until the facility was finally decommissioned and dismantled. It didn't matter. He'd said what needed saying. The hours until dawn passed quickly. Caleb made final preparations, checking and rechecking his supplies, studying the maps and coordinates until he could navigate to the target location with his eyes closed. He practiced manipulating the Kronos anchor, familiarizing himself with its dials and settings, ensuring he could install it quickly, even with cold fingers and limited visibility. In the mess hall, he ate a final meal of hot food. He'd figured out how to use the heating equipment, knowing it would be his last hot meal until he completed the mission and found civilization again. The ration packs were nutritious, but couldn't compare to actual cooked food, even institutional military cooking. As he ate, the donkey appeared in the doorway, fully recovered now, standing steady on all four legs. Caleb couldn't explain it. The animal should have been dying, should have at least needed days of rest and treatment. Instead, it looked ready to walk back into the blizzard, as if the facility itself had healed it somehow. You knew, Caleb said to the donkey. You knew all along where we were going and what I'd find here. How is that possible? The donkey, of course, didn't answer. It just stood there, patient and ready, waiting for morning and the journey ahead. Caleb finished his meal and gathered the last of his supplies. The pack was heavy but manageable, and with the proper winter gear, he felt confident about the 3-mile trek. The storm had passed, according to instruments in the command center. The weather would be cold but clear, perfect for navigation and installation work. He made one final circuit of the facility, saying goodbye to a place he'd never see again. The library where he'd learned about the future. The command center where he'd grasped the stakes. The living quarters where he'd found warmth and rest. Each space held meaning now, had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. At the entrance, Caleb pressed the control that would open the massive steel door. It swung inward with that same pneumatic hiss, revealing pre-dawn darkness beyond. Cold air rushed in, shocking after hours in the controlled environment. He could see his breath now, white clouds in the orange light. The donkey moved beside him, ready to leave. Caleb shouldered his pack, took one last look at the impossible facility, and stepped out into the mountain darkness. The door began to close behind him, sealing away warmth and light, leaving him with just his pack, his mission, and a recovered donkey that somehow understood more than any animal should. Dawn was perhaps an hour away. The coordinates were 3 miles distant. He had plenty of time. Caleb Stratton, temporal anchor, began walking through the snow toward a future he would save, but never see. The cold hit Caleb like a physical blow, despite his layers of modern clothing. The temperature had dropped significantly during his time inside the facility, and the pre-dawn air felt sharp enough to cut. He paused just outside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness while his body acclimated to the sudden temperature change. The steel door sealed shut behind him with a finality that should have been frightening, but instead felt right. That chapter was closed. What lay ahead was his purpose, his mission, the reason the universe had conspired to bring him to this exact moment in time. The donkey moved confidently through the snow, its hooves finding purchase where Caleb's boots slipped. He followed, grateful for the animal's sure-footedness and apparent knowledge of the route. The facility had provided him with a map and compass, but having the donkey as guide was reassuring, a companion in the pre-dawn darkness. As the first grey light of dawn began illuminating the eastern horizon, Caleb could see the landscape more clearly. The storm had transformed the mountains, covering everything in a thick blanket of white. Drifts rose higher than his head in places, sculpted by wind into shapes that seemed almost intentional, like nature was creating art from frozen water. The coordinates on his map indicated he needed to reach a specific peak, one that rose above the surrounding mountains with a distinctive rock face on its western side. He could see it now, perhaps 2 miles distant, its silhouette sharp against the lightening sky. The donkey was leading him directly toward it, confirming that the animal somehow understood the destination as well as he did. The journey was brutal despite his preparation. The new boots were better than his old ones, but they weren't broken in, and he could feel blisters forming after the first mile. The pack, while efficiently designed, still carried considerable weight. The Kronos anchor alone weighed several pounds, plus all the installation equipment and survival supplies. His shoulders ached, and his lower back sent sharp protest with each step, but he pushed on, driven by purpose and deadline. 3:47 p.m. He needed to be in position well before then, needed time to install the device properly to ensure everything was ready when the moment came. Rushing would risk mistakes, and mistakes could cascade through time in ways he couldn't predict. The sun rose fully, painting the snow gold and making Caleb squint despite the shadow cast by his hood. The temperature barely rose with the sun's appearance. This high in the mountains, winter held firm, regardless of daylight. His breath came in heavy clouds, and ice crystals formed on his beard where moisture from breathing condensed and froze. Around mid-morning, perhaps 3 hours into the trek, the weather changed. Clouds rolled in from the west, dark and heavy, promising more snow. Caleb checked the barometer on the watch he'd found in the facility, an amazing device that showed not just time, but atmospheric pressure and temperature. The pressure was dropping rapidly. Another storm was coming. He thought about the weather station logs he'd seen in one of the facility's rooms, predicting this exact pattern. The record showed that October 22nd, 1883, would see a brief, clear morning followed by a severe afternoon storm. The person writing those logs, working from data collected decades in the future, had known Caleb would be making this journey in these exact conditions. They'd warned him, prepared him, given him the tools to succeed despite nature's interference. The first snowflakes began falling as he and the donkey started the final ascent toward the peak. The slope was steep, requiring him to use his hands in places, grabbing rocks and exposed roots to pull himself upward. The donkey picked its way up more easily, finding a game trail that Caleb followed gratefully. By noon, they'd reached the rock face indicated on his map. It was a sheer cliff of granite, perhaps 30 feet high, facing west toward the valley below. According to the installation instructions, the Kronos anchor needed to be mounted exactly 17 feet above the base of the cliff, positioned at specific coordinates with precision measured in inches, not feet. Caleb set down his pack and surveyed the cliff face. The rock was solid, good granite with plenty of cracks and features for climbing. He'd need to ascend to the correct height, secure himself with rope, drill holes for the mounting brackets using the hand drill in his pack, then install the device itself. The work would take hours, especially in the cold with the storm intensifying. He looked at his borrowed watch. 12:34 p.m., 3 hours and 13 minutes until activation. Plenty of time, assuming the storm didn't make conditions impossible. The donkey settled into a sheltered spot against the cliff base, patient as always. Caleb laid out his equipment, organizing everything he'd need within reach. The Kronos anchor itself, no longer in its protective box, gleamed dully in the flat stormlight. Such a small thing to carry such enormous importance. Just brass and steel, precision-crafted, waiting to be hammered into time itself. Caleb strapped on the climbing harness he'd found in the facility, tested the rope's strength, and began his ascent. The rock was cold under his gloved hands, but the holds were good, and his ranching background had included enough rockwork to make him comfortable with the climb. 17 feet up, he found a ledge just wide enough to stand on. Perfect. This was the spot. He secured his rope to a sturdy outcrop and leaned back, testing the anchor. It held firm. Now the real work began. Above him, the storm clouds gathered, and the snow began falling harder. But Caleb barely noticed. He had a device to install, a timeline to stabilize, and a world to save. The weather could do its worst. He had work to do. The installation work required precision that fighting the cold and wind made nearly impossible. Caleb's hands, even gloved, grew numb as he worked, forcing him to stop periodically and tuck them inside his coat to warm them against his body. The storm had intensified to a full blizzard now, wind driving snow horizontally across the cliff face, making visibility drop to a few feet. He drilled the mounting holes, using the hand drill from the facility, a remarkable tool that cut through granite with surprising ease, its bits made from some material harder than any steel he'd known. 4 holes, positioned exactly according to the template in the instructions. Each one measured 3 times to ensure accuracy within the specified tolerance of a 1/4 inch. The mounting brackets went in next, secured with bolts that expanded as he tightened them, gripping the rock from inside the drilled holes. He tested each bracket, pulling with all his strength, making sure they wouldn't fail under the device's weight or the stress of decades of weather. The Kronos anchor itself mounted to the brackets with surprising simplicity. 4 screws, hand-tightened, holding it firmly against the rock face. Once installed, it looked almost natural, as if it had always been part of the cliff, a strange growth of brass and steel emerging from granite. But the device wasn't complete yet. Caleb consulted the instructions again, snow already obscuring the laminated pages, and located the final components. From a sealed package in his pack, he withdrew 4 small brass rods, each one precisely calibrated according to markings along their length. These inserted into ports on the device's surface, clicking into place with satisfying precision. The dials came next. According to the instructions, each of the 3 dials around the device's circumference needed to be set to specific values, numbers that corresponded to nothing Caleb understood, but which he matched carefully to the diagram. First dial, 47. Second dial, 283. Third dial, 1962. That last number he recognized, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The critical juncture everything led toward. With the dials set, only one step remained. Caleb pulled out the brass key, the simple old-fashioned key that looked like it belonged in his time rather than in this technological marvel. There was a keyhole on the device's top surface, barely visible beneath accumulating snow. He brushed the snow away and inserted the key, feeling it slide home with smooth precision. His watch read 3:44 p.m. 3 minutes. Caleb checked the instructions one final time, making sure he'd followed every step correctly. The installation was complete. The dials were set. The key was inserted. At exactly 3:47 p.m., he needed to turn the key 1 complete rotation clockwise, then wait for the device to activate. He clung to the cliff face, rope securing him to the rock, wind howling around him, and watched the seconds tick by on his borrowed watch. The storm seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was trying to prevent what came next. Snow stung his face, and the cold had penetrated through all his layers, making his core temperature drop to dangerous levels. But he held his position, hand on the key, waiting. 46 p.m. 1 minute. Caleb thought about everything that led to this moment. The failed business deal, Sarah leaving, the storm that drove him into the mountains, the wounded donkey, the impossible door, the facility full of warnings about the future, Dr. Hernandez's letter, Colonel Morrison's hope that wisdom would prevail before necessity demanded it. 1 man, 1 moment, 1 turn of a key. Such a small action to carry such weight. 47 p.m. Caleb turned the key. At first, nothing happened. The key rotated smoothly, completing one full revolution before stopping with a soft click. Caleb held his breath, wondering if he'd done something wrong, if the device had failed, if 80 years of planning had come to nothing because of a malfunction or his own mistake. Then he felt it. Not a sound or a visible change, but a sensation that ran through his entire body like a tuning fork's vibration. The air itself seemed to shift, becoming thicker, more substantial, as if reality had been liquid and was now solidifying. Colors changed subtly. The white snow became somehow whiter, more definite, more real. The granite under his hands felt more solid, as if it had been partially transparent before and was now fully present. The device hummed, a sound so low it was almost below hearing, more felt than heard. The brass fittings glowed faintly, not with heat, but with something else, some energy that had no name in Caleb's vocabulary. Then as he watched, the device began changing. The brass darkened, tarnishing decades in seconds. The steel weathered. The seams where it met the rock filled in with mineral deposits that hadn't existed moments before. The device was aging, or rather, settling into its proper place in time, becoming part of the mountain rather than an addition to it. Within minutes, the Kronos anchor looked like it had been there for years. Within an hour, as Caleb watched from his precarious perch, it appeared ancient, integrated into the rock face so completely that only someone who knew exactly where to look and what to look for would ever notice it. The activation sequence was complete. The anchor was set. The timeline was stabilized. Caleb slumped against the rope, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He'd done it. Whatever else happened, whatever failures marked the rest of his life, he'd succeeded in the one task that truly mattered. Millions of people would live because of what he'd just done, and not one of them would ever know his name. Below him, barely visible through the blowing snow, the donkey stood and moved toward a darker area of the cliff base. Caleb forced himself to focus, to follow where the animal was looking. There, a cave opening, small but deep enough for shelter. The donkey was showing him survival, giving him one last gift of guidance. Caleb began the careful descent, his cold, numbed hands barely able to grip the rope. Each movement was calculated, deliberate, fighting exhaustion and hypothermia. The storm raged around him, but the worst was over. The mission was complete. Now he just had to survive long enough to live in the world he'd saved. His feet touched ground, and he collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, ice crystals forming in his beard. The donkey nuzzled his shoulder, patient and steady. Caleb gathered his remaining strength and crawled toward the cave opening, dragging his pack behind him. Darkness enveloped him as he entered the shelter. The cave was small but protected from the wind, and that was enough. Caleb pulled out the military sleeping bag, climbed inside fully clothed, and let his eyes close. Outside, the storm howled. The Kronos anchor hummed its silent song, anchoring time itself. And Caleb Stratton, temporal anchor, drifted into exhausted sleep, his mission complete and his place in history secured, even though history would never know it. Caleb woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed and crystalline. Sunlight streamed into the cave entrance, refracting through ice crystals to create tiny rainbows that danced across the cave walls. His body ached in ways he'd never experienced, every muscle protesting as he forced himself to sit up, but he was alive. More than alive, he was purposeful. The donkey lay near the cave entrance, watchful and patient, as if it had maintained guard through the night. When Caleb emerged from the sleeping bag, the animal stood and stretched, ready to continue their journey. Outside, the world looked pristine. The storm had scoured the mountains clean, leaving snow packed smooth and brilliant white, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Caleb pulled out his father's compass, the brass one that had spun uselessly inside the facility. Here, in the clean mountain air with the Kronos anchor now installed and humming its silent song somewhere above them, the needle settled immediately, pointing true north with steady certainty. But Caleb noticed something else. Faint scratches on the compass's face, barely visible, seemed to form an arrow pointing west-southwest. He'd never noticed them before, or perhaps they'd always been there, and he'd simply never looked closely enough. West-southwest, toward the cache Hernandez had mentioned, toward supplies and gold coins and a second chance. He packed his gear methodically, leaving the climbing equipment in the cave. He had no more need for it, and carrying extra weight made no sense. The military sleeping bag, the remaining ration packs, the medical supplies, and the remarkable carbine all went into his pack. These he could explain if questioned. Found in an old prospector's cache, he'd say. Lucky discovery during the storm. People would believe it because they wanted to believe in luck, in found treasure, in providence. The descent took most of the day. Caleb and the donkey picked their way carefully down the mountain, following valleys and ridges, avoiding the steepest slopes where avalanche danger lurked. The donkey seemed to know the way, leading Caleb along paths that, while difficult, were passable even with heavy snow. They found the cache exactly where the map indicated, marked by the distinctive rock formation and dead pines. Someone, presumably agents of Project Kronos working backward from the future, had buried a small strongbox here and covered it carefully. Caleb dug through the snow and frozen ground, using tools from his pack until he hit metal. The strongbox opened with the same brass key he'd used to activate the Kronos anchor, a detail that made him smile despite the cold. Everything connected, everything planned. Inside, 20 gold coins, each one dated appropriately for 1883 or earlier. A leather pouch containing bills, actual U.S. currency from his time. Documents that established him as Caleb Stratton, recently arrived from Wyoming, looking for work in Montana. The documents were perfect forgeries, or rather, they were real documents created through means he didn't understand and didn't need to. They'd pass any scrutiny, would let him start over with a new identity if he chose, or simply reinforce his existing one with added legitimacy. There was also a sealed letter, brief and final. This is your last gift from us. Use it well. Build something good. Remember what you've seen, but speak of it to no one. The timeline is stabilized. Your part is complete. Thank you, Caleb. Live well. P.H. He read the letter twice, then burned it using his matches, watching the paper curl and blacken. No evidence, no proof, just memory and mission accomplished. It took another 2 days to reach the small town of Timber Creek, following the valleys down from the high mountains. Caleb appeared at the edge of town on a cold afternoon, leading a grey donkey, carrying a well-used pack, looking every inch the prospector who'd spent time in the mountains and emerged with modest success. The townsfolk were welcoming in that cautious way of frontier communities. The local store owner, a man named Jensen, offered him work when Caleb explained he was looking to settle for a while, wait out winter before moving on. Caleb's experience with ranching made him valuable for various odd jobs, and the gold coins ensured he could pay for room and board without raising suspicion. But it was the telegraph office that truly drew his attention. The operator, an elderly man named Williams, was looking to retire, and the telegraph company needed someone to take over the position. Caleb, who'd always been good with his hands and had a head for patterns, applied for the job. Williams spent 2 weeks training him in Morse code, in the operation of the equipment, in the protocols of message transmission. Caleb took to it naturally. Something about the work resonated with him. The way messages traveled across vast distances in instants, connecting people who couldn't see each other, carrying words that shaped events and decisions. It reminded him of the command center, of systems linking across time instead of space, of networks that bound together moments separated by decades. He settled into a routine, working the telegraph by day, maintaining the equipment, sending and receiving messages that connected Timber Creek to the larger world. The donkey, which he'd named simply Gray, stayed with him, living in a small stable behind the boarding house. People remarked on how attached the animal seemed to Caleb, how it followed him around town like a faithful dog. In the evenings, Caleb would walk to the edge of town and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He'd pull out his father's compass, checking that the needle still pointed true. noticing those faint scratches that formed an arrow he now understood, pointed not just toward a cache, but toward purpose itself. One evening, perhaps 3 months after his arrival in Timber Creek, a stranger came to the telegraph office. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, with weathered features and eyes that held something Caleb recognized. She sent a message, something mundane about livestock prices, but as she was leaving, she paused and looked at him. "Nice compass," she said, nodding toward the brass instrument on Caleb's desk. "My father's," Caleb replied. "My mother gave me one just like it," the woman said, "though mine points in a different direction sometimes. Depends on where I need to go." Their eyes met, understanding passing between them without words. Another anchor, another person who'd been pulled into Project Kronos, who'd completed a mission, who carried secrets they could never share. "Safe travels," Caleb said. "And to you," she replied, then disappeared into the evening. Caleb Stratton sat in his telegraph office as the sun set and the lamps were lit throughout Timber Creek. Outside, Gray the donkey waited patiently in his stable. Above in the mountains, a device hummed its silent song, holding time itself steady. And across the years, spreading forward to a future Caleb would never see, the consequences of his actions rippled outward. A timeline stabilized, a crisis averted, millions of lives saved. History would never know his name, but Caleb knew his purpose. He'd been broken, ready to die. Now he was a telegraph operator in a small Montana town, sending messages that connected people across distances, living a quiet life that mattered more than anyone would ever know. He picked up his compass, watched the needle point true north, saw those faint scratches that only he understood, and smiled. He'd been given a second chance, and he intended to use it well. The brass compass felt warm in his palm, a legacy from his father, now infused with new meaning. 3 generations of Stratton men had carried this compass, but Caleb was the first to use it to navigate not just geography, but time itself, to find his way through impossible circumstances to a mission that saved the world. He set the compass down and returned to his telegraph key, tapping out a message for a rancher 30 miles away. Simple words about cattle prices and shipping schedules, the mundane business of everyday life. But every message connected people, built relationships, shaped small decisions that would accumulate into larger patterns, rippling forward through time just like his actions on that frozen mountain. Caleb Stratton, temporal anchor, lived on, and the world he'd saved continued spinning, carrying millions of people toward a future that almost hadn't happened, preserved by a broke cowboy who'd found purpose in the most impossible place imaginable. Outside, the stars emerged, brilliant and cold. The compass pointed north, and tomorrow would come, as it always did, because Caleb had made sure tomorrow was possible.